Welcome to Rico 12. I'm Justin B., your host and a child of an all-powerful and perfectly loving God and an addict living in the miracle of recovery one day at a time. Rico 12 is dedicated to exploring the common threads of addiction, sharing tools, and offering hope from those walking a similar path. We gather from diverse backgrounds, faiths, and locations and fellowships to learn and support one another. Our speakers also come from a variety of fellowships and experiences demonstrating the universal principles of recovery. This is Rico 12 speaker meeting number 325. And thank you for joining us live or in the recording later. Today's speaker is Levi H, discussing the topic of service keeps us sane and sober. I look forward to hearing his message shortly, but first for a few quick announcements. Rico 12 offers a variety of recovery resources, including this podcast and other podcasts and social media communities. To learn more, visit www.rico12.com or check the chat and show notes for links. Rico 12 is self-supporting and your contributions help us continue this message. Thank you to all our Spearhead donors, past and present, especially this week to Sirata and Naomi, who were contributors this week. We really appreciate your support. It truly does help make a difference. If you'd also like to contribute, visit rico12.com/support or check the links in the show notes for one-time or monthly donation options. Every bit of support, financial or through word of mouth, helps us share these messages of recovery. Each week, we receive light and inspiration from our speakers. Their experience brings hope, meaning, worth, and growth to us as listeners. Now, I'm going to welcome today's guest speaker, Levi H, and we can learn just a little bit more about him. Levi is a member of SA and S-Anon and has been sexually sober since July 20th of 2017. And a member of S-Anon since January of 2021. Outreach to therapists and clergy and service to others has been a huge part of his recovery. Take it away, Levi. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, live or in person or at the listening later. I'm Levi, recovering sexaholic and member of S-Anon. Like was said, I've been sexually sober since July 2017. And then later I got into S-Anon in 2021. So I'm going to try to start my story from the beginning and I'm going to try to do my best to weave the two together. Let's see, I'll start with saying that I was raised in a very religious home. So some of my really core early memories have to do with my family's religious faith, participation in religious services. And another thing that marks my early history is that I grew up in a very poor family in a rural area. And also, so that kind of, left me feeling less than. So some of one of my earliest memories that I have is we didn't have a car and we lived 2 miles from our church, so we all walked to church together. So there you go. But around that same time was the first time that I was exposed to pornography. What on earth are you doing, Kat? Around that same time was the first time that I was exposed to pornography when I was 4 or 5. And it took an oversized role in my life. So by the time that I reached puberty, I was involved in incest and bestiality. I was on the giving and receiving end of sexual abuse and incest. Trying to think of ways to be sensitive with this, especially since it's going to be recorded. And so that progressed very much, so that by the time that I was in my teens, I was having regular intercourse, and basically everything that I saw in pornography, I acted out. The term in SA, a lot of times people talk about acting out. And to me, what that means is reenacting. It's one of the things I think of, is that I have a mind that was given to me by my Creator, and if I obsess over something long enough, I will make it happen. And that's a characteristic, that ability from my thoughts to create situations is a characteristic that I believe I got from my creator. So anyway, my religious participation was all along. I mean, I was getting involved. My biggest heroes were religious leaders all through my childhood. And I really, 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 I think it's important that I not underestimate the sincerity of my childhood faith. I really wanted to be those things, but I didn't have the capability to follow through. I was, like I said, involved in sexual acting out, pornography. I was coming up in the 80s and 90s, and so there was no internet at the time. So it was like magazines and stuff that my brothers and I hid in our room, but also my friend's DVD and VHS collection, if you remember what those are. And so then, and then when I would see it, I would obsess, and then I would make it happen with somebody else in my life. Um, the specific sex acts is what I'm saying. And when I was about 17, I had sort of a deepening religious conversion experience, I would say. And by that point, I was kind of experimenting with drugs and alcohol with my friend group. And I was able to drop those right now, like, in a moment. But I couldn't stop with the lusting and with the sexual acting out. Um, that continued. I actually went to a school for my religious faith, and in my school, I was I was sincerely seeking after this faith life that that God had called me to. I felt like, and I wanted to have a life in ministry, and so on and so forth. But after a year and a half at the school, because of my inability to live up to the lifestyle expectations, in particular when it came to sexual immorality, I was asked to leave, and it broke my heart because identity was all wrapped up in this idea of what I was supposed to be and who I was going to be. I tried to enter into an accountability relationship with a religious leader from my childhood, and the thing about me and accountability relationships prior to recovery is that oftentimes that meant that they were responsible instead of me. And so, because he didn't ask the right questions, I kept the secrets and I continued to act out. Only now I was a college age guy acting out with girls that I'd gone to high school with. And then in 2000, well, in 98, I met my wife. She was a sweet, naive farm girl. And I met her, and um, I really corrupted that relationship from the very start. And so and also from the very start, it was always the case that there was somebody else. Not that I ever physically cheated on my wife or sexually cheated on my wife, because I'm just not very good at it. But it wasn't for lack of trying. I was always obsessed with someone else and infatuated. I was always trying to cultivate emotional and flirtatious relationships with other women. Even though my wife and I are sexually compatible, and I really, really love her. She's my best friend. Um, and that continued on. So in 2005 or so, I went through kind of another deepening religious conversion where I got into a more traditional form of my faith. And I thought that this would fix me. This is something I hear a lot from people in recovery, is the idea that religion, if applied correctly, will fix me. This is, to me, is a variation on the self-knowledge cure, is this religious cure. And so, I was raised an army brat, so I had a fair bit of the geographic cure in my upbringing and in the way that I approach life. So, and I did this religious cure for all I was worth. I went on special religious trips to special religious places. I did the religious things. I tried to bare my soul um, to the person that's in charge of the care of my soul. And in some ways, it made it better because I became a periodic, and so yeah, I became a periodic, and what I mean by that is that I would maybe make it a period of months or something without porn and masturbation, but in my recovery now, I can look back and see that I was really drunk on lust every day. Um, so in uh, in 2016, so I was trying to start affairs at work unsuccessfully, thank God. And I was in therapy for some emotional things. And I mentioned this to my therapist, that I was like being flirtatious and suggestive with coworkers and trying to get affairs started. And she was like, "Yeah, that needs to stop right now." Like she took it pretty serious. And I was like, now that we mention this, I really think I should be in therapy for my sex addiction, and this emotional stuff is kind of just a surface kind of a thing. So I did. I got into sex addiction therapy, and um, about like 3 months into it, because I was uncovering some of my childhood trauma. I mean, I was in a lot of that was a really painful process, but I thought that I was cured. I would say I was like, man, this is really working. And then my therapist said to me, I think you and your wife should take a period of sexual abstinence, 90 days. Um, and and he said something about how usually the spouse is the one that wants to break it because they whatever. And I held on to that. So that night in the grocery store, I told my wife, this is the kind of sexaholic I am. I said, my therapist thinks we should take a period of abstinence. And she said, okay, well, we can start tonight. And I was like, how about we start next week? And or the week after, so they're like, give me a time to build up to it. And so then we agreed to start, and I proceeded to seduce, manipulate, and coerce my wife into sex. So we were in a period of abstinence, but then when she would give in to my seduction, manipulation, and coercion, it would be her fault that we broke the period of abstinence. Um, and so I was making her responsible for my own sobriety, is what I'm saying, which is a pattern in my marriage. Is that I would have her have the password to the internet filter, or I would have her have this, or have her have that. And it's really not fair to my wife, who didn't sign up to be my mother. And But I was making her my mother, and at the same time, I was sexually abusing her from the time that I met her. And so this 90 days of abstinence, lack of abstinence, lasted from March until July, and my binges on porn were getting worse. So one of the things I mentioned is that I have a history with bestiality and incest. And when I had obsessive thoughts about incest, my solution was to watch incest themed porn or stepfather porn or something like this, right? To get it out of my system. And if you're not a sexaholic, you're thinking that's a crazy solution. But if you're a sexaholic, you're thinking, that checks out. Maybe that would work. And so that's what I did, and it made it worse. Made it even more entrenched, the obsession. And I binged out on porn. I mean, sitting in my living room on the family iPad, wondering if my children will catch me. My wife was out of town, and this as a I think that I bring up religion because to me, this is an important part of the unmanageability of my disease, is that I was like real involved in church. I still am. And I was like representing that to my children, and trying to teach them or whatever. But I'm just obsessed and drunk on porn. So in July 2017, uh, it was getting worse. I went to my first SA meeting. I stopped acting out for 3 days prior to it, which is still my sobriety date. So my first SA meeting was in July. It was July 23 of 2017, and there was only one guy there, and he didn't particularly have the solution, although he had the literature, so he could point me to the solution in the literature. And about a week or two later, I remember talking to him about this period of abstinence that I was trying to do, and where does that fit in the steps? And he was like, "I don't know anything about that. I don't think that's a thing. Maybe you call this old timer in another city." And so I called a guy in another city who was sober 25 years in SA, and he says, Levi, I was 12 years sober when I got married in SA. You understand that means I was celibate for 12 years? So if you're looking for sympathy, you're calling the wrong damn guy. That's what he said. And I was like, good grief, and I remember saying to him, well, I'll call you back if I need any more encouragement, probably in a sarcastic voice. And the truth is, though, that talking to him, I knew that he had what I needed. He had what I wanted. And so then later the next week, I remember I was having kind of a fit at work, and I called him, and I'm obsessed with lust, and I'm angry too. And he says, Levi, you're sick. What do you do? Is there some kind of drink or food you eat when you're sick to kind of take care of yourself? And I was like, well, I like chocolate milk. And he says, well, why don't you drink a chocolate milk and then go back to work? And, basically he was saying, like, take care of yourself. You're really, really sick. So I made it to my first SA S-Anon retreat in August of 2017. And I remember I asked that same guy, I said, I need a sponsor. And he says, well, let's talk later. And I kept asking him throughout the day. And at the end of the day, I didn't have a sponsor. And I had committed that I was not leaving without a sponsor. So I badgered him and I said, I need a sponsor. Um, and he said, you know what? Just call me tomorrow, like almost to get me off his back, I think. So I did. I called him the next day. And it was probably a week before I realized that he was my sponsor. He taught me how to check in about my lust, my fears, my resentments, and eventually dishonesty and selfishness. And he taught me how to start talking about those things in a way that's specific, but without dwelling on the details. He started taking me through the steps from the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, um, and also, with some particular flares, the SA ads, I guess. So when I was about 30 or 45 days sober, I went to give my first step away to his home group, which was a big meeting, the biggest meeting I'd ever been to. And I told all my story to a bunch of crazy people. And I was a blubbering mess and just weeping because I shared more details of the things. I told them all the things I'm ashamed to tell you right now, or at least to put on a recording. And and so then I was a blubbering mess, just weeping. And within a few days, I asked my sponsor, "How sober do I have to be to start a meeting in my town?" The closest meeting was 45 minutes or an hour away, and he said, I don't think it matters. I think it'll keep you sober if you start a meeting in your town. So I remember reading in the white book that we should reach out to pastors and therapists and doctors and things, and they may have sexaholics to refer to us. So I took this for real. I called every pastor and therapist in my town, and then I would follow up with an email. I talked to them about SA. I kept it anonymous. I just told them my first name. Um, And by the time that I worked the second step and the third step, my sponsor was like, I think it's really cool how you're trusting God that this won't come back on you and kill and, like ruin your life. And I'm like, I hadn't even thought of that yet. Like I was just doing it to survive. And this is part of the message that I think that we carry to professionals and to the newcomer is that my reason for doing this is my sobriety, is my sanity. And it's not because sometimes pastors want to be like, "Oh, that's so cool. You're such a good person." I'm like, "I promise I'm not. If you had read about me in the paper for the things I wanted to do, you would not be thinking I was a good person." But thank God, because I worked this program, I don't have to do those filthy things that I thought I wanted to do. So I within a couple of months, somewhere in there, I had a pastor offer us a location to meet, and we started our first meeting. By that time, I had 12 stepped my next door neighbor, and I'll tell you how I did that. I texted him, I said, "Hey, do you know anybody who struggles with porn and masturbation?" And he was like, "Yeah, me." And I was like, "Cool, I found a solution I want to share with you." And so he started coming over to my porch, and he would sit with me while I called into meetings, and we would talk about sobriety or whatever, and it was this is the very beginnings of our meeting, and our meeting started out with just the two of us. My sponsor said, he might not be ready for the program, but he'll come just to support you. And he was right, he did. And eventually he got the miracle and he stuck around. And he's still one of my best friends in recovery. And so the outreach doesn't stop, because one of the things my sponsor told me is that in order to grow a healthy local meeting, you need like 4 newcomers a month. So you need to constantly have referrals from professionals in order to get newcomers, or have a bunch of people in your group that are 12 stepping their friends and neighbors, whichever one. But so letting professionals know that we exist and when our meetings are, or where our meetings are, if that's your group's conscience, um, is super important, because those are the people. So in my experience, therapists have referred the most people, because usually maybe by the time they get to a therapist, they're pretty desperate. um, I think pastors and other clergy refer people to us, but maybe they don't get desperate enough. Um, so let's see. In 2020, my kids were, I'll say, exhibiting some risky sexual behaviors that concerned me. And I talked to my sponsor about it. I was obsessing over it, and my sponsor said, I think you should call this sponsee of mine, so my sponsor brother, and I called him, and he said, Levi, I've got a similar situation, although it was really clear that his child was addicted. And he said, I think you're going to need an Anon program. So I got into an Anon, I got into S-Anon in January 2021, and I started working. So I'm a part of a network of S-Anon men who have meetings together and so on and so forth. And I basically got assigned a sponsor, and I called my assigned sponsor, and he started taking me through the steps from the S-Anon literature. And while I was working my first step, I remember realizing that because I was raised in a household of sexaholism, I relate to my non-sexaholic wife like she's a sexaholic. I'm always waiting for her to leave me or cheat on me. I used to fantasize about how she would leave me by cancer if she had to, but at some point she was going to abandon me and she was going to leave me. Now, as a sexaholic, I would usually end up sexualizing that to make myself feel better. So then I would think about all the women that were going to comfort me at the funeral. But so I realized that because of the first sexaholics in my life, which probably my parents had internet affairs before that was a thing. Still while we were on dial-up back in the day, and where they had to like take turns on the computer, and this has left me with like this profound fear of loneliness. Um, and then my wife, who's as far as I can tell a normie, um, she's a pretty normal, well-adjusted woman, and I relate to her like she's just waiting to cheat on me, waiting to hurt me, and it's not fair. The other thing is that I found that in my sickness, my S-Anon sickness, I would say, I'm really clingy with her. I make her into something that she doesn't want to be. My wife didn't want to be my higher power. She didn't sign up for that. But I made her the God of my life. Um, and um, yeah, so as an SA, I can see that I sexualized the heck out of that relationship to where that was like the base. So in S-Anon, there's a reading that says, we believe that sex is the most important sign of love. Many sexaholics have this belief too. I think I have it deep down. Sex is the most important sign of love. And from the time that I met my wife, that's what I was teaching her. So I didn't tell you this, but when uh, when we finally were able to have a period of abstinence, my wife and I now take periodic periods of abstinence just to right size sex, the role of sex in our marriage, and to focus on our friendship, and to just grow emotional and spiritual intimacy. When we finally got there, she said, I never knew that I was allowed to say no when you asked for sex. That broke my heart, because because as much as I'm able, I love this woman very much. And the idea that I would send the message to her that her body was mine to do with it what I wanted, and if she didn't go along with it, then I was going to throw a fit, throw a temper tantrum, and or that I would blame her if I had to go and act out or whatever. That's tragic. That's what I mean when I say that I sexually abused my wife. Although I also tried to, be sexual with her without her consent when she was asleep. Um, so, um, so to get back to the topic of service keeps me sane and sober, which that's a really good topic. I can't believe I said that. I like that. I like that topic. But is that for me, the way that these programs work is by me focusing on others. And what I've seen is that I've seen a lot of people come into the rooms and they focus on their own pain, their own suffering, their own sobriety, so on and so forth, and they never make the transition to life. The purpose of the 11 steps before the 12th step is the 12th step. In the big book, it says that we're here now to be fitted for maximum usefulness to God and others. Like that's the purpose of my sobriety. My sobriety is not even mine. It's from God. And God has given it to me so that I can give it to others. So, and not just in the programs either. So one of the things that I think of is that before in my addiction and my illness, I wasn't able to show up completely in my religious community. I was always somewhere else. I was I was always out of fellowship with my religious community. And but now because I'm maintaining sexual sobriety, and because I give an awful lot of my time to service to other addicts and anons, I am able to show up in a way that I was never able to show up before, and to be present. One of the things that I think of is that before recovery, I was like a burden for my religious leaders to carry. I was like the cross those guys are carrying. And now in my recovery, I can come alongside them and help them with difficult cases in the church. This is true. So in the last 6 months, I've made a point of reaching out to all the religious leaders in my region within my faith community, and to offer the solution that I've found. Not to say that it's the only solution, but for me, this is what's worked. This is the only thing that's worked long term. And to say that this is a thing, if you have people who think that they might need SA or S-Anon and they're reluctant to try it because it's not from our faith community, then have them call me and let's talk about it. Because I can help them to overcome those barriers maybe. And so there's a thing there's a new SA pamphlet, which I highly recommend, called For Members of the Clergy, or Members of the Clergy Ask About SA. Just brand new, just came out. And it talks about how that, and also in the pamphlet for the Helping Professionals, which is a similar tone, it talks about how that we want to always cooperate and never compete. So, this kind of thing right here, RICO 12, is an idea that, shows that all these different 12-step groups, we can come alongside each other. Maybe everybody doesn't need SA. Maybe they need some other kind of recovery and some other kind of recovery group. When I was early in recovery, I thought everybody needed SA. I thought everybody I saw was a sexaholic. And but that was me. I was the sexaholic. But anyway, but also I thought, oh, that's codependent. This is codependent. This is, and it's not really mine to judge. It's mine to hold out the solution that I found, and people will take it or they won't take it. And if I'm able to be there for them, thank God. And if they don't need it, thank God. If they can get where they need to go and in right relationship with their higher power, with or without the 12-step programs, thank God. So I'm really grateful to be here for service, because that's one of the things that has been a theme to my recovery, is this great gratitude, because I was so broken, and God took that brokenness and turned it into an asset so that I could serve others. And because of, if I didn't have the crazy story I have, or the sickness, you guys wouldn't want to hear my story. So here I am. Thank God I get to share my story. So thanks for letting me share.
Got questions about addiction, recovery, or just life in general? Let's noodle it out together. Grab your big book, a pen, a highlighter, and a notepad, and join Nikki M. and me, Justin B., on Rico 12 Noodle It Out with Nikki M. Each episode, we take real-life questions, ours, yours, and those from the recovery community, and dig deep into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous to find real, practical solutions. So, if you're ready to do the work and apply the solution, tune in to Noodle It Out with Nikki M., streaming now on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you so much, Levi. I really appreciate your share, and I've written down several things that I've got questions about. I want to remind our live audience, if you have a question for Levi, please type it in the chat. If you want to remain anonymous, not have me read your first name, please direct message me that question or type anonymous before the question, and we'll get to those questions. But Levi, once again, I really appreciate your experience, your strength, your hope, your willingness to share some vulnerability here, and just how important service has been in your own sanity and sobriety. So what I'd like to start off with, Levi, is a question here that came out towards the end of your share. You talked about, my whole life I was religiously trying to religion my way through this to get sober. But now, as you have found sobriety and recovery, you are a much better practitioner of your religion. Talk to us a little bit about the difference between religiosity and religious faithfulness.
So one of the things I'll say something. So I sponsored a priest one time, and he talked to me about how that using religion to deal with addiction doesn't work because it's a corruption of both how we should work on our addiction and what religion's purpose is anyway. So I approached religion in a magical way. If I do X, Y, and Z, then God has to show up and take my addiction away. I like what it says in the White Book, which is that I always wanted God to do the quitting for me. Instead, now I stop. That's surrender. I stay stopped. That's surrender. And then God gives me the tools and the power to stay stopped. So that's one thing. I think in the second step, so also a little bit about me is that when I'm still in the same religious community I was when and still in some of the same roles that I was then. But when I engaged in recovery, I had to ease up on some of my, I'll say, observance. And I've heard that from a lot of people who are long-term sober, is that in order for me to really grab a hold of the program, I had to ease up. And I remember going to my religious leader and talking about this, and he said, you don't have to worry about that because your recovery is your duty to God right now. I had another guy said that this is your spiritual discipline. Go to meetings, work with others. This is your spiritual discipline. And by spiritual discipline, again, I don't mean in magical thinking, like I'm going to make God do something, but changing me. Like for me, that's the purpose of spiritual disciplines, is to change me. So then I think that because I got a new higher power in the 12 steps, sometimes I think of it like my lizard brain. I know that's kind of like a psychobabble term, but my lizard brain has this higher power that wants to zap me if it catches me doing wrong. But my rational brain has this like spiritual, theological belief of what higher power is like. And I needed to kind of merge the two. I needed help to adjust the one back there, because the one back there was the one that was driving my addiction. And so I had to set that aside. And then from that place of feeling totally accepted by God, then I can re-engage in the spiritual disciplines from that place. And when I say that, I don't mean to say that my religion was telling me that God didn't accept me. That's not how it is. I mean that my addiction was interpreting my religion to me. It was like the lens that I saw the world through. So I hope that helped.
Yeah, it did. And I want to go just a little bit deeper in that. You said, in the 12 steps, I got a new higher power. As I look back at my own life, the pre-recovery Justin, the concept of God of my own understanding, or God as I understood him, was something that I really shunned in the 12 step community. It took me a while in 12 step when everything else failed to come to the point where I was willing to say, you know what? This God of my understanding that I've carried for decades is not working. Talk to me a little bit about that process in your own experience.
Um, I have another friend who's a priest in recovery who says that the third step should say, insofar as we understood him, because in reality we never understand God. If God's all encompassing, then we can never fully reach the bottom of that particular well. So we never fully understand God. And so what the 12 steps are saying is in humility, I come and I say, this is where I'm at today. This is where I understand God today. And tomorrow I may understand God a little different. I may see different facets of God. And that's humility to me. To me, my higher power shows up humbly, anonymously in the 12 step rooms. That's how humble my higher power is. You know, we all say we introduce ourselves by our first names. My higher power comes as God as you understand God. And that's how humble my God is. So the other thing I was going to say that almost escaped my mind um, is God with skin on. Is the idea that I needed to be loved by fellow sexaholics and S-Anons in order to really believe deep down that God loves me. So to me, in my home group, I'm a hugger. I'm not a hugger. I was raised not a hugger. I mean, I was probably 19 before I remember my father ever telling me he loved me. And any kind of like affection that I remember from early in my childhood was usually a consequence of a physical abuse scenario, like trying to make up or something. Anyway, so I need hugs in my meetings. I need to learn how to receive hugs from fellow sexaholics so that I can receive a hug from God. There's a line that some people say in recovery that says, "Let us love you until you can love yourself." You know, which is so I needed that love just poured on me. And my higher power loves me so much that he filled our rooms. You know, our essay that we have, I didn't mention this, our local group has 5 meetings a week now. And we have, I don't know, a couple dozen random assorted sexaholics in our essay meetings here. And God loves me so much, he sent me tons and tons of sexaholics to work with and to be loved on by. And that's a sign of God's love for me. So,
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I love, I also have a priest who is one of my recovery mentors who describes God, and he says, "I wish the third step would actually say God as we don't understand Him,"
mhm.
and I think that's pretty powerful. All right. So another question, an insight that I had here is that you said, I thought sex was the most important sign of love in a relationship, in marriage. How did you go about breaking that or having that broken, that understanding there? Because, well, I still battle that, and I know that so many people that I interact with also feel that way, whether they identify as a sexaholic or not. So tell me about that process.
Mhm. Um, well, it took, so when my wife and I were in a period of abstinence now successfully, after I talked to that old timer, um, we started to identify all these different ways that our sex relationship was infected. I'm ashamed to tell you, but my wife had learned that she couldn't sleep with her back to me because I would molest her in her sleep. And she had learned that, all sorts of different things. And so we had to have all these boundaries. And then what we ended up with was a lot of time that I wasn't seducing her or chasing her around the house, a lot of time for us to fill with something else. So we found out that we were good friends and we liked to take walks together and we like to play board games together. My wife and I like to play Nintendo together. I know that's an outside issue, what particular system, but we like to play video games together. That's just a silly thing that we like to do when we want to have just friend time. And so that's one of the signs of love that I found that I needed was to deepen the friendship I have with my wife. And if I'm focusing on that, and focusing on the love relationship that we have that's non sexual, then sex, when it happens, is like a special treat. And so when I hear sex is optional in the White Book, especially, I think that it doesn't mean that it's wrong to want sex with your spouse. I think what it means is that it's it's harmful to need sex with your spouse. And so for me, I had to get to the place where I would surrender it. I could take it or I could leave it, and that was work I had to do in me. So that's the other thing I was going to say is that I find that the fruit in my marriage comes from me putting my recovery before my wife. So my wife sees me go to meetings. She sees me travel for SA, S-Anon, and going, like really pouring myself into my recovery, working with others, and that this is where the fruit in our marriage comes from. I think my wife recognizes that now, because she encourages me to do those things. Uh, and then the fruit comes back slowly, slowly, slowly. That's the other thing in the White Book. It's really clear that the time frame for real healing in the marriage from sexual addiction is long. It's a long, long time. And so it's painful and but it's also joyful. So.
Hey, Spearheads, if you're looking to dive deeper into the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous with people who live the solution, then you won't want to miss RICO 12 Big Book Roundtable. Join David G., Nikki M., and me, the moderator Justin B., 3 recovered addicts from multiple fellowships, as we break down the big book line by line. In each 30-minute episode, we share our experience, strength, and hope in a real, raw, and practical roundtable discussion. So, if you are ready to learn and apply what you learn, tune in to RICO 12 Big Book Roundtable on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for sharing that, Levi. All right, let's jump over into service a little bit here. You talked about almost, for lack of a better term, being an ambassador of SA and S-Anon there,
Mm-hmm.
with clergy, with therapists and stuff like that. Was that scary to start doing? What and how do you maintain a semblance of anonymity as you go out into the community talking to these people?
Yeah. So I tell you what was scary. The things that I wanted to do would have put me in prison. So that was more scary. I remember hearing on an essay tape, they won't lose respect for my recovery like they would for my active disease. And I kept thinking to myself, you know what? If I stay sick, I'll be on the paper. I'll be in the paper. Um, so that's one thing. So when I would call them, and I would tell them my first name. I would usually say something like, "Do you have people in your congregation, or are you working with people who struggle with porn and masturbation?" And because that's a strange way to start a conversation, they would like gasp. And while they were gasping, I would start talking about SA. And I would be like, well, the reason I'm asking is that I'm in a 12-step program that for folks with sexual addiction, and I need to help others in order for me to stay sober. And and I was clear that the nature of my addiction is that it will ruin my life. Um, so then once I got wise to it, I set up an anonymous email address, and I would follow up with like a group email address. One of the things my sponsor encouraged me was not to leave it there, but to continue to kind of build that relationship by giving them updates. He says it's like a sales job. They need to see that I'm going to stay, and then I'm going to stay involved. And so I would email them, this is what's going on in the group anonymously, of course, and say, we're having this event, or we're having this event, or the groups are doing well, or whatever. Um, and yeah, and then actually, as I got farther along, I realized that so there was a time when I accidentally emailed all of my ministry contacts, all my ministry contacts, from my personal email address because they're both Yahoo addresses, and so they're both on the same app. And I called my sponsor freaking out. And he's like, Levi, I doubt they even care. You're not that important. It's not like you're the president. And they're gonna, so um, and so then over the years now, when I do outreach, especially within my own faith community, I email them from my personal email address. And because to me, anonymity in the 11th tradition is about at the level of press, radio, films, TV, and the internet. And so as long as I'm not like putting my face on a billboard, I'm not going to harm the fellowship by emailing. And in my faith tradition, if I email them from my personal email address and tell them where I live, they're going to contact my religious leader and ask me if I'm and ask, check my bona fides, they're going to make sure that I'm on the up and up, and they may as well have my full name. So that I still do a lot of outreach. Sometimes when I have bad days, I'm feeling kind of like obsessive or whatever, I will just email all the clergy or all the therapists in the neighboring town. And I one time I talked to my grand sponsor at an international convention, and I told him, like, this is 12-step where carry the message to professionals is like my new addiction. I think it's pretty sick. And he's like, well, don't get too well yet. In other words, God's using this compulsivity to help others. Thank God. So,
Thank you for sharing that. I love that. All right, Levi, I want to go back to, you talked about lust and sexual acting out. I'd like to ask if you can define maybe a difference between what is lust versus what is sexual acting out. Is there a difference, and what does that look like?
so what is lust? Well, one thing I think it's important that I recognize that the temptations that I have are not necessarily lust. Until I choose to receive it and engage it, either engage it by arguing with it or engage it by going along with it. It's just there, it's floating. I think those thoughts are not me. This is how I view the world. Those thoughts are not me, or they are me, but they're a part of me that is my addiction, or however you want to say it. And so I don't have to receive those thoughts. When I receive them, then they can become lust. And lust can be sexual, which is what I focus on a lot, but it could also be all sorts of things like, an inordinate desire for cars or shoes or cookies, or I really like cookies, so I would leave that one off. But it could be any kind of excessive like obsession over it. One of the things that I think of, I tell people all the time, is obsessing about obsessing is obsessing, you guys. So don't get real obsessive about it, compulsive about it. Oh no, did I just do a lust? And So then sexual acting out is when my actions begin to take those, begin to, put them into action. I think I said somewhere in there, like, the way that my thoughts work is if I obsess enough, I will make it happen with myself or someone else. And so that's why I can't live there. Because acting out is the sexual acting out, or whatever acting out is the result. And sometimes it's just the foregone conclusion once I've chosen to obsess over it. I can't decide when I get off the train. So I try not to get on the train today. So, and my acting out took the form of being flirtatious and suggestive, and, flirting, text messages, Facebook, obsessive use of Facebook and social media, obsessive use of the internet, pornography of all forms, and chasing my wife around and sexualizing everything about my wife, and acting out with pets and family members in the past. And so there's a whole variety. And I think the point is that once I get on the thing, I can't decide where it's going to go. Like, by God's grace, I'm staying off the train today, and that means that I don't have to do anything I'm ashamed of. So.
Hey, Rico 12 Spearheads. If our recovery resources have helped you, please consider a donation. Your financial support, as well as your word of mouth support, keeps Rico 12 running and reaching the man who is still sick. Donate today at rico12.com/support or check the show notes for PayPal and Venmo links. Every contribution helps carry the message. Thanks for being a Rico 12 spearhead. Thank you for sharing that, Levi. All right, another question I have for you is you talked early about an accountability relationship that you tried to set up with a clergy member or, somebody that you trusted at that point, and that you turned that person kind of into your higher power. Your sobriety was dependent upon that person's
Mhm.
accountability questions to you. What is the difference between an accountability relationship and a good sponsorship relationship?
So, one of the things is I think as a sponsor, um, the sponsee is still responsible. They're the responsible one. So, in the White Book, it describes getting a sponsor doesn't give the responsibility to the sponsor. It's taking responsibility for my recovery without taking charge of it. So actually, it frees me up to have responsibility for my actions, for my recovery actions, because someone else is the one making some of the decisions. And especially at first, it's important because I can't trust my own decisions. And so then it's like, okay, should I go this way or should I go that way? And then they tell me, and then I surrender to that. The actions I take based on the suggestions of my sponsor are my responsibility. And to me, you know, that means if I'm living in recovery, I tell on myself to my sponsor. My sponsor does not have to find out. This is actually how I do things with my spiritual leaders too. Is that my goal is to tell on myself to my spiritual leader and to my sponsor um, before while it's small before it gets big, and then um, yeah, then that because like if I have to call the sponsor and he has to say, did you do this? Did you do that? Did you do that? Did you do that? In order for me to stay, so my first sponsee was a guy whose therapist assigned him to me, and I was codependent enough in the early days that I said, oh, okay, I guess that's what we're doing, and so then I probably a week or two into it, he called me and I was busy, and he next time I spoke to him, he said, I called you and you didn't answer my call, so I acted out. And for a little bit, I took that on myself and I said, oh, what terrible sponsor I was. And I was like, wait a minute, no, you just roped me in. That was your responsibility. You better get a longer phone list, buddy. You better get some more people on that phone list. If you only call one guy and then they don't answer, so you go ahead and act out, then you're making me responsible. And then that's when I began to see that when I had that internet software that would send my email, my internet history to people, I would think as long as they didn't reach out to me and check on me, that I was fine. It was fine. I was kind of playing around with the edges, or I was sneaking around, or whatever. As long as I didn't get called out, it was fine. But that's not how I live my recovery today, because I want to stay back from the cliff, rather not go off it.
Yeah, man. And what you said there towards the beginning of that is a game changer for me, at least putting it into words this way. I need to take responsibility for my own recovery without taking charge of it. That is a vital perspective to hold as a sponsee and as somebody who's coming into the rooms for the first time. Thank you for sharing that. Do you have any other thoughts on that concept before I move on to another question?
Um, Taking responsibility for my recovery without taking charge. So I think that this also continues further down the line as I stay in recovery. I learn to trust. I learn to trust my intuition that comes from God, and I don't have to run everything by my sponsor. When I was coming in recovery, I would call my sponsor and I would say, "I think I'm going to do this," and he'd be like, "That sounds sane." And I would test those thoughts, those intuitions, by my sponsor. I still do that. So one of the things I think of is that if God is really telling me something, he's going to tell the other people around me. If I'm the only one God's whispering a thing to, it's probably not God. So if my wife isn't hearing the same message, or my spiritual leader, or my sponsor, and I say, well, I think it's time for me to do this, and they're like, what? Then it's probably not God, it's probably self-delusion. And so that's a part of it too, is like surrendering over to God, to my spiritual leaders, to my sponsor, to my spouse, because we're partners in life together, and recognizing that the primary ways God is going to show up and say to me is in that still small voice, the intuition, but it's also in these other people in my life that I trust. So,
No, this is great. All right, before we start closing up here, Levi, do you have any final words of wisdom that you'd like to share with us?
I don't know if I have words of wisdom. You'd have to ask my home group. Just kidding. I the So my favorite part of the white book is the section getting started, and I work step zero with my sponsees. That's the first thing that I do. I didn't talk about my sponsorship approach today, but that's the first thing that I do with sponsees when they're getting sober, is to go through the section getting started, because I think it's impossible to maintain steps 1 through 12 without maintaining step zero. And step zero is we show up to the fellowship, right? And we show up and we keep showing up. I'm one of those rare ones that I've been sober since my first meeting, and I'm really grateful for that miracle. But I know that a lot of my friends are coming and coming and coming and coming to meetings, and they're not staying sober. So it's really important that then they focus on step zero. Just show up, do the things, bring the body, go to meetings, 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 work the steps, make phone calls, tons and tons of phone calls. And because without the fellowship, the steps, that's why for me sponsorship is so vital, because the sponsor is a connection, a real concrete connection with the fellowship. Otherwise, the steps can just become kind of like cerebral, intellectual, and or self-helpy. And instead, to be like, this is a real life that I live with my fellowship. So, by the way, I didn't mention it. My home group is the Bozos on the Big Books bus meeting in Kearney, Nebraska. That's my SA home group. My Wednesday night S-Anon home group is called Targeting Recovery, and it's on Zoom. I'm super grateful again for service, and I'm super grateful for my home groups because they keep me relatively sane. They would say maybe not sane, but relatively sane and sober. I'm going to keep coming back. Thanks for letting me share.
Thank you, Levi, for sharing your reasonably sane and sober message. And it's been very powerful for me. And I'm sure many people, whether here live or listening to the recording, will gain something from that. If somebody wants to reach out to you, Levi, are you okay if they contact me and I connect them with you?
Yes, of course.
Awesome. So if you want to reach out to Levi, send an email to rico12pod@gmail.com. That's RECO12pod@gmail.com, and I can connect you with Levi. All right. If you out there have not already done this yet, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on Apple Podcasts and or Spotify. It's a powerful way to work step 12 and getting this out there to more people who may need to hear this message. Next Friday, we hear from another first-time RICO 12 speaker, Santosh M., and we're excited to hear from him. To stay up to date on that, please get on the email list if you're not on that, or join us in our WhatsApp community. I put those links in the chat here and also in the show notes of the podcast, and how to do that. Let's wrap this up with the submission prayer that Levi will say for us.
God, I give this day to you. Establish the work of my hands, the steps of my feet, the words of my mouth, the direction of my gaze, the thoughts of my mind, and the attitude of my heart. Amen.
Amen. Amen. All right, everybody, remember there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find God now. Keep coming back, and when you do, come all the way in, sit all the way down. Let's trudge this road of happy destiny together. Work it. You are worth it.
life of mine. Peaks too high to conquer, streams too wide to cross, troughs too deep to walk through without incurring loss. Yet here I am, still standing tall, despite the rough terrain. One like me survived the storms and walked through wind and rain. Still standing, I will fight the good fight. Still searching for glimmers of light. Feet still on the ground, I can still be found standing still.
My wings are torn and tattered, but I know I still can fly. I may not soar unfettered, I may not rise too high.
Recorded in the book of life and bind it with the seal